So next up, we will have Austin, and he will be speaking to us about color accessibility with elm-hsluv. So please join me in welcoming Austin. Thank you, Austin.
Hey, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about accessible colors with elm-hsluv and a few other friendly, helpful libraries. So the basic premise is that I was working on a side project, very sort of bare bones, just getting started, and I wanted to think about like light and dark themes, and that sort of led me down the rabbit hole and got me into reading probably way more articles about accessibility than I should have. But just to kind of start, I want to set the premise that we expect beautiful user experiences out of the box that just sort of work, right? These are the incumbents. These are the people we are trying to become or beat or whatever in, as software developers working for companies or otherwise. We've got features like audio and video integration, and it's all supposed to be real time. So we expect gradients, animations, blurs, widgets, WYSIWYGs, just effects out the wazoo. Things like TikTok. We expect text to be white on a dark background and for brand colors to pop, right? But what really happens when we're spinning up a new site, or an app, or an idea today? This. We've got raw HTML5, buttons, unstyled, and I mean, Space Jam's website from 1996 looked better. So obviously, as developers, we've got a long way to go getting from the start of a project to a working product that has more than just semantic HTML element styles or basic Bootstrap templates. And so what do we do? You just add some CSS or, but you need JavaScript, right? Because you got to have interactivity, and CSS can only take you so far. But personally, we're all Elm developers here, so we sort of share a common either dislike and or just that we like Elm better for certain things than whatever, so we'll use that. But then what if this language doesn't do Y, and then do we change languages? Do we hire more people? These are questions that businesses ask that don't really have good answers today. All that to say, I did some research, and sort of I'm, albeit slowly, building the future that I want. So I want to read a few articles to familiarize ourselves with some terms sort of necessary for the understanding the solution space. So things like WCAG level, tone scale, color blindness, etc. Start with just the general idea is that we want to talk about accessibility. And there is a working group that defines the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And the idea behind this is to define basically what qualifies as readable. So basically, it's about having a contrast ratio for colors stacking on top of each other. You've got, if you're presenting text or images of text, they have to have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 in order to satisfy a sort of AA rating. There's also AAA, which I think has to have like a 6 or 8 to 1 contrast ratio. You might think, well, I program in CSS, and HSL has a sort of more programmatically friendly interface because it's cylindrical, so you can sort of manipulate the hue or the lightness independently of each other, instead of trying to take all the RGB values and manipulate them in sequence together to increase the brightness. Programmatically, the cylindrical model is just going to make a lot more sense. The problem is that we have to address this thing called a tone scale and understand the difference between, see if I can find those images here real quick, like why we would need, or what are the shortcomings of RGB and HSL? Is an image, although I think it's probably here. Yeah, here we go. So the problem with RGB and HSL, if you can take a look at these images, there's 3 sort of zones where the relative luminance of that color at 50 in HSL, so lightness 50, is brighter than everything else. And for blue, notice that it's sort of a dark zone. And so this is inherently the problem with RGB, is that the lightness across the different hues is not consistent. So if you try to program a tone scale to guarantee a contrast ratio of 4.5 or 1 or higher, it's going to be really difficult because you're going to be having to make adjustments for the differences in lightness across the hue spectrum. And so enter elm-hsluv. Elm-hsluv is a package that wraps the LCH color space. So you can take an Elm color from the Elm colors package or otherwise, and specify it according to RGB, and convert it to LCH. LCH is a color space that it's a cylindrical version of the lab color space that basically normalizes the saturation of the gray or the lightness for all of the hues, such that you get a sort of even modality across all of them. And you can see that best here in this picture, where the two outside borders define the RGB color space. And inside, you can see that the lightness, the relative luminance of each color, is normalized. So the problem space is that the existing solutions don't work well. And I'm going to go into why. The why is because they're all palette-based. They sort of force the developer to try to prevent these kinds of situations where you have a really bright yellow that has a very high degree of luminance, very close to white, against a white background. And you think, well, just don't render yellow on a white background. Yellow should be rendered on a dark background. But what if your brand chose yellow, right? Like, what if the company that you're working for won't allow you to use, a certain color combination for this particular component in this particular case, right? So, and if you have dark blue or something on a dark background, you're going to have the same issues. These are sort of notoriously hard to debug, difficult to avoid sort of issues. And the palettes just force developers to have to understand these sort of color theory type terms, which we shouldn't have to. It's just far too easy to not make impossible states impossible. So when I was researching, I found this guy on Twitter who was talking about some sane defaults that most businesses are sort of going for when you're building an app. And these come sort of from the design aspect of things. Here's sort of a common brand vibe one, where you have clean sans serif fonts with bright primary colors and subtle border rounding and shadows. And in my head, I'm sort of thinking, how can I generalize this so that this kind of branding could be configurable, but also generalized such that every component in a UI UX design system can sort of adapt to whatever the brand is. And how do we guarantee that all of these colors aren't going to be susceptible to the accessibility issues that we had before? So can we build components that adapt to their surroundings and still be able to make guarantees about accessibility? And so next, I'm going to show you what I did. So the existing color libraries define things for accessibility like high contrast or like subtraction or addition of colors. They define the whether or not two colors meet an accessibility ratio rating. But what I found missing was how do I make two colors meet the accessibility? How do I force it? How do I modify colors such that they do meet the accessibility ratings? And this is where hsluv came into play significantly, because it made this function easier to reason about. Before I was writing this with the RGB color space, and it ended up being sort of a recursive function where I was adding or subtracting one from every color, every channel of the colors to get it to meet the accessibility ratings. And with hsluv, you can literally just do math. So you can take the lightness of whatever the bottom color is, and if it's greater than 50%, then just subtract the whatever contrast ratio it is that you want to go for. And then otherwise, you add that contrast ratio. And then there's a small edge case if you're really going for high contrast, where you have a small font and a AAA rating, where you have to push both layers. You have to push the top and the bottom layer a little bit in terms of the lightness of whatever hue it is that you're going for. what's cool about this is it enables you to build primitives that can adapt to a light or dark theme. So here I've got sort of a custom version of my brand config that I'm putting together to build out for a palette that I'm going to then use in a bunch of components that use this. And such that the components that I'm using, like text or buttons or radio rows, etc., don't have to know what color they are. They just are the correct color. At least that's the goal. So we go over here to the demo. You can see here I've chosen like a purple hue, and all of the text renders correctly on a dark background, and then all of the brand text is far enough away from the background to satisfy the Lighthouse accessibility scores. Now let's see if this works, because sometimes Lighthouse doesn't catch it. Quite annoying. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it should be 88 is the idea. And then when you flip it to a light theme, the idea is that this purple should be dark enough against a white background as to be legible by people who are colorblind. AKA, if I converted this site to black and white, it should still be readable. And that's just not going to be the case if you're developing with a palette-based solution where it's the developer's responsibility to choose the right color over whatever context that component is being rendered in at the time. And so that is pretty much the demo. I can show you some other cool stuff about this thing, that we can change pretty much the entire vibe of the site in a hot minute. We've got blue now. That's sort of a light sky blue against a dark background. Hit dark, and now it's sort of a readable blue against a light background. I can switch to formal fancy, and we're going to get some square borders, and it's going to flip to that gold. So it's going to be gold sort of on a white background, but then yellow is sort of just bright enough against a dark background that you don't need to change it. And you can see that these, what I'll call like utility colors, are sort of consistent across the different brands, and they're useful for just building apps in general. But they adjust correctly according to whatever the background is. So this is sort of a light blue. This is a darker blue, and the red is sort of becoming more vibrant here, and it has to be a sort of a lighter red against a dark background. So what's left? Probably everything. Highlighting still doesn't feel quite right. There's more generalizations for things like padding and spacing, typography, hierarchy, all other sort of sizing-based properties that I have to figure out. And sort of like how to guarantee that components are laid out such that a developer doesn't have to concern themselves as much with like pixel perfection or grid perfection, which I think is solved pretty much already at the Elm UI layer. Pushing more things into the context object. I'm using a library called Elm UI with context, which allows me to sort of use the reader monad pattern to pull properties off of this context object that I define at the top of the program. I18N, something I haven't really dove into yet, and obviously just building more components. Things like tooltips and dropdowns, I should probably be using web components, because you can push superfluous state like that into web components, and it drops the API surface area of a component down to like just a simple view function. I've got like a table component and some autocomplete stuff that I probably need to pull into this, and then of course integrating Matthew Griffith's work on animations from Elm UI v2 when that comes out. And that's it.
Fantastic. Well, first join me in thanking Austin for his talk. Thank you, Austin. Cool. So yeah, open floor for questions for Austin.
Hi, I have a question. So if I understood correctly, your library, like the core part of your library, you tell it, I have this background color, and then I have these highlight colors, and now I want this tool or this library to automatically make sure those colors are correctly distant from the background colors, so that it all works regardless of what background color you pick.
Yep. And you're actually not picking the background color. You're picking the brand color. So this would be like if I work for company X and they like orange is their like brand color. I've seen this a lot when, or I should say you'll see this a lot if you use something like Material UI, where there's like a primary and a secondary color that you pick in when you're setting up the palette. And the problem with that is that like I've run into issues where like I'm working on a link or something, or a list menu, and the links for whatever reason render the wrong color against that background. And it's because you're picking it sort of at the component level versus the component sort of knowing what they're rendered on and being able to render themselves far enough away from the background. And so that's what that widen function was. And that's really all it is. It's just a function. It's not necessarily as much a library so much as the library is building components that use that function. And that are sort of like aware of the palette or the theme that they're being rendered with. And that's where like the Elm UI with context comes into play, because you can build up what that palette looks like at the beginning of your program, instantiate it, and then all the components can use it.
I have another question.
Go for it.
Is there just one background color then? Because like often you have like a one background color, but then like a container has like a lighter shade of that background color, or maybe a slightly different color or something like that.
So I haven't gotten into that yet, but it is a situation that arises, and how I assume that will be handled is you'll instantiate a new context object. So where like you'll have that background color, and I feel like I could make the background color programmatic. And the point is, the widen function will just like it'll just push them however they need to be. So
okay, so like like if you have your font and it works with the background color, but then the container is a lighter shade, and then like if that font is too close to that lighter shade, it'll just push it. So it's like the theme will change a little, but it has a good contrast then.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
So what do your designers think when they see that their colors that they've chosen are slightly off compared to their designs?
Revolt.
So what is it?
Presumably you can just be like, it's not my fault, it's the WCAG compliance, right?
Yeah, like you should be better at like understanding accessibility for colorblind people. Maybe like I don't know, but to be honest, like I haven't actually used this in production yet. So I would like to, and I think a system like this would be nice to build against, which is why I'm building it in my free time, which is also why it'll probably never be done, because you know how big these projects are, and I'm one person with very little free time.
So just as an extension to that, do you think it would be possible, have you thought about maybe using this as a tool pre-build to communicate back to designers? So for example, like, say design comes to you with a theme that has this bunch of set colors. And let's say with elm-hsluv, the first thing you do is you enter all those kind of base brand colors in. Presumably you could have a function that just generates like a palette and shows all of those in context used together and identifies which ones were non-compliant and had to be shifted. Maybe that could be like a feedback point directly back to the design team as a way to catch it early on rather than later down the track.
Yeah, so you could implement that as part of like your storybook if you have something along those lines in Elm for all of the components and stuff. And what it would be is you'd just be using the meets accessibility functions sort of in line with like whatever component it is that's using that color. But the goal is that with the widen function, you shouldn't need that, right? That it should just like do the right thing. And I will also add that if you want to just sort of like get feedback about a palette beforehand, you can use this website, I guess Toolness, GitHub Accessible Color Matrix, where you could put those colors that your designers give you into this little palette thing here, and it'll tell you here are the ones that you can use, and then here are the combinations that you can't. So to an extent, that's sort of already been built, but pairing that with like a storybook would be something that would have to be like built ad hoc.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other questions for Austin as we wrap up?
I have one question. I'm just curious. I can't imagine that this happens too often. But what happens if the background color is just a middle gray? So it's like as close as possible to everything else.
So So part of the framework I'm building for myself, or the component system that I've built, is that you can't have a middle gray background.
Okay,
that's
that
just like a
seems
big no-no.
sensible.
Yeah. You also can't have a colored background, because if you have a colored background, then you've basically eliminated certain of those. What did I call them? I'll share this again. So you can't have these utility colors, right? So if I choose a red background, then obviously I can't render the utility color against that, because the utility color will become a black or a white in order to be far enough away from whatever your background color is. You can get away with the background color being like a really dark shade of like a dark gray with like a blue hue or something like that. That's still like really dark. So like there's a few different shades of gray here in the dev tools, and you can get away with that. But your background, generally speaking, has to be like a black or a white.
So the address bar in your browser, the yellow address bar would not fly.
Well, okay, so and this is goes back to what Mario was asking about, or somebody asked about stacking colors, right? Or I think you did actually. Like the background of components, it's hard to explain. Like it just depends on how you build it, right? The widen function, all it does is push two colors apart. So if you set the background of a component to be the foreground color, the brand color, right? Then your text, I mean, just as you're building the component, has to be like high contrast with whatever that is, which is something I was experimenting with those utility colors here. And I was going to demo these as like toast messages, right? With the background color being that utility color. The problem you have then there is that the background color of the component against the background of the entire window against the text color, like you can't be far enough away one way or the other. And so that's leading me more to like, if you're going to build like a modal or a drop down or something, the background color of that should probably be the same as the regular background, and you should be using things like border shadows and stuff to create the hierarchy in terms of like layers.
It would be cool to have some kind of like color constraint solver, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really cool.
I feel like you'd end up with like some weird sepia filter over your whole site.
Yeah, these are all the colors I picked. What happened?
Yeah.
Very great. In that case, join me again in thanking Austin for his talk. Thank you very much, Austin.
Thanks, everyone.